This is Duke University.
Welcome to all of you all for coming this afternoon for this special visitor who spoke to my class this morning and dazzled us, and I'm sure he will dazzle you all as well. As you all know, there's one person I want to introduce because this is his first visit. He's just taken office. Is Mo here? I haven't seen. There he is. Mo is the new executive director of the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, who has just taken over, and we have the good fortune of having not only at least one board member of. I was going to say that, but I knew I knew that, but I looked at you and I saw, well, there's one trustee as well. So the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation is well represented here today. But we welcome Mo, and we hope we'll see a lot of you. It's a pleasure to have you here. You all know who our guest speaker is today. Really impressive guy who has come out like a starburst in the firmament of foundations in this country. He was born in Louisiana. He went to undergraduate school at the University of Texas at Austin, law school at the University of Texas at Austin, and then went to practice law in New York at Cleary Gottlieb, where he practiced for a while, and then moved on to the Abyssinian Development Corporation, which is a community development corporation in New York, I would say similar to the Harlem Children's Zone in an earlier phase. He went to the Rockefeller Foundation as a vice president in 2002. Doug, there's a seat right here for you. There are no other seats. Please come.
We'll sit back.
No. Come sit up here. I'm sorry. You see the last two seats. Great. So in 2002, he moved to the Rockefeller Foundation as a vice president. I think Judy Roden recruited you. You were before Judy, maybe?
I was before Judy.
Before Judy. And then 3 years ago was recruited to be the president. He moved to the Ford Foundation when Luis Ubiñas was the president of the Ford Foundation who recruited him. And then when the Ford Foundation, Luis decided to retire, the board selected him unanimously as its new president of the foundation. And he has been going strong ever since. He took a year to try to figure out where to go with the foundation, and then he has been going there. So this is a great opportunity. He suggested that we have basically a conversation. I'll sort of be the mediator and sometimes inquisitor, but I'm counting on all of you all also to be inquisitors as well. So I want to start by asking Darren if he would reflect on the state of philanthropy in the United States, but particularly foundations. As you all know, there have been many pro and con views, recently con views about foundations, recommendations in a variety of sorts. And Darren has played a role in talking about these things over time. I thought it would be a good place to begin. And then we will go from there. I have a few questions to ask, but I'm counting on you all to ask questions as well. So Darren, welcome to Duke. It's such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Joel. And it is indeed a treat for me. First, to see my long-standing friend, I don't dare call you my old friend, Joel, my long-standing friend, Joel
I am old.
who continues to inspire me. Because, Joel, you have a zest and a love of life that is so rare. And I am motivated by you in so many ways. And I always look forward to seeing you in New York. But to be here in this little amazing place called Duke University, I totally get why people are addicted to this place. It is absolutely magic here.
Don't forget Chapel Hill. There's a Chapel Hill. Okay.
And Chapel Hill. It is truly I totally get it now. And I will say, I mean, when you come to places like this on days like today, and you think about what it was like when you went to that amazing, inspiring airport called LaGuardia and boarded a flight here, it's really easy to understand why people don't board the flight going back. So thank you for the privilege of being here with you.
Honor.
And as Joel reviewed with me the many distinguished North Carolinians who are here, I'm just deeply honored and grateful for the opportunity. The state of philanthropy. It is among the most exciting times in the history of American philanthropy. It is because there is more wealth, there is more innovation. I think there is a deeper sense of opportunity that can be achieved through the deployment of private wealth for public benefit. And therefore, I think as someone who is passionate about philanthropy, this is not since John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie have we had such a moment of the convergence of just the sheer amount of wealth being created in this country and the capacity to innovate. So from my standpoint, it's really an exciting moment. That's not to say that there are not some troubling dimensions of this moment that keep me up at night. One of the things I ask myself is, do we have among this new generation of wealth the kind of humility that John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie exhibited as they thought about the many problems that they were setting up their foundations? And sometimes I still ask myself, is there the humility necessary? And sometimes I think the answer is yes, and sometimes no. Because I think among some of the new philanthropists, the sense that they're taking on these huge challenges and need to approach it with humility and a capacity to listen is there. And with others, I think that they think that because they were smart and created a widget that is shiny and new and made them billionaires, that they can take that same skill and fix public schools or figure out the challenge of youth employment. And so I like to remind people that John D. Rockefeller was an innovator. He understood and he figured out how to extract and refine oil. But he didn't think that he could fix public schools or that he understood the answer and the solution to public health and that people just needed to listen to him. He actually found the best experts and really smart people and listened to them and were guided. In many ways, he was guided by their counsel and their wisdom. And sometimes you don't see enough of that.
Right. There have been a lot of criticisms about foundations recently as well. And to me, it seems like the criticisms are coming from both the right and the left. Do you have any thoughts about that? I mean, you've spoken on this subject before about the role that perpetual foundations have played. Reflect a little bit on that.
Well, it's what we're experiencing is this convergence of both of great wealth, the growing inequality, the sort of populist revulsion on the one hand at the concentrated wealth in the hands of a few people is not new. John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie were reviled people. They were, by the American public, at the height of their business success, they were truly nefarious characters who people in polite society did not often choose to associate themselves with. And certainly the media was just downright cruel to their representations of Rockefeller and Carnegie. And so, when John D. Rockefeller set out to establish the Rockefeller Foundation, the charter, he did that in 1910, as you know.
Tried to get a congressional charter.
They would not give him a charter to give away his fortune because Congress said nothing good could come from the wealth of this horrific, nefarious character.
That's right.
And so John D. Rockefeller's lawyers lobbied Congress for 3 years, unsuccessfully, to allow him to charter the Rockefeller Foundation. And his lawyers ultimately said, you're going to have to go to Albany, New York, where you're domiciled in that state, and get the state attorney general. Because this was before there was a scheme for regulation with the state's attorneys general. And so literally, he gave up. And so, the fact that today there are some who would question why Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chang, what they're doing with that $44 billion of Facebook stock, and why did they establish an LLC and not a charitable private foundation? Was there some effort to extract a tax benefit? What are they doing? And it's not transparent. I mean, all of these things, there's nothing new about any of it.
Right.
It is, I think, symptomatic of a time as we had in 1905 to 1915, when there was not an income tax in this country, and where there was huge suffering and huge levels of inequality in the United States, when people were questioning the very notion that such extreme wealth and such extreme deprivation should live side by side in our society.
Right.
Nothing new about it.
Right. This morning, you talked, and you've written a good deal about this, about your plans for refocusing, sharpening the focus of the Ford Foundation on inequality. I think that the members of the audience today would be really interested in how you see that developing.
Well, when I took over as president, I initiated a process of discovery, of really understanding, first, being very clear with the trustees about our mission. And we have one of those long missions, but I think what I will say and what we agreed in the shorthand was that the Ford Foundation seeks a more fair, just, and peaceful world. And as we agreed on that mission, affirmed that mission, we asked the question, what are the greatest threats? A foundation that works around the world, what are the greatest threats to achieving that mission? And what we learned was that there were three global trends that are threats. The first is climate, which we all know and understand. The second was growing insecurity, and you only need to have turned on the television this morning to see what happened in Brussels to understand the dimension of growing insecurity in the world. And the third was inequality, growing inequality. Again, a global phenomenon, no matter where you are in the world today, there is a profound effect of growing inequality. And then we asked ourselves, all right, what do we as a foundation, as we assess our own capability, capacity, resources, both human and financial, among these threats, what can we work on to have an impact? Doesn't mean that they're not all important, but we have to assess and evaluate what we could actually move the dial on. And I think it was inequality ultimately where we landed. Again, not because climate isn't the most important, and in fact there are many foundations working on climate change, but there isn't a foundation that has named inequality as a challenge. And so it was really I think a great process that was rigorous and that allowed us to learn a lot about ourselves and about the world and what's going on, talking with experts from all over the world. The other part of it that was really revealing was consulting with experts about what the drivers, therefore, were of inequality. So why is inequality growing around the world? And what we learned from talking to economists like Thomas Piketty and Joe Stiglitz, to technologists, to all sorts of people, was that there were many drivers that sound pretty technocratic. Those drivers like technology and automation, what's happening with education around the world, trade policy, financial flows, globalization, et cetera. When we started to really dig down and talk to a broader set of people, including sociologists and cultural anthropologists, was that there were another set of drivers that rarely come up. And those drivers, we believe, are very important, and we're working on them now. And so the first one was cultural narratives and practices, that actually there are cultural narratives in a country like India about caste that in some ways justify why Dalits and lower caste people are on the streets of Delhi and Mumbai begging, and that even in polite society, it's perfectly acceptable to simply accept that. Why women aren't in the sciences or not making partners in a law firm, or there are cultural narratives about that. Why are there so many black men in the United States locked up in prisons? There are narratives that actually are trafficked in, that reinforce the idea that they're in prison because they're more likely to be criminals. And if you're more likely to be criminals, then why would you be surprised that so many of them would end up in prisons? And so this notion of cultural narratives has become, for us, a very important rallying cry for a different kind of intervention that isn't just looking at those technical inputs of financial flows and technology and automation, but asking these more fundamental questions about cultural narratives, about persistent prejudice. So we also know that in societies, no matter where you are in the world, whether it's in a country like Kenya, where we have an office where we have to talk about the challenges between Luas and Kikuyas, who clearly are Kenyan, but of different ethnicities, and therefore, because they're of different ethnic tribes, the way they relate to each other is in many ways the way African Americans and whites relate to each other in the United States. These kinds of prejudice exist in all societies. The challenge is they reinforce and reify historic exclusion of people. And unless you name it and frame it, it's really hard to figure out ways to address it. And so we have persistent prejudice in the United States that is deeply rooted in our historic manifestation of racial hierarchy and an economy that has depended in some ways on racial hierarchy. So it's why we have a two-tiered minimum wage system in the United States.
Say a word about that.
The reason we have a two-tiered minimum wage system in the United States goes back to the antebellum South. When freed blacks weren't actually paid in a regular way. They were paid, as Pullman porters, for example, were paid on tips. This was a cultural practice. And when Franklin Roosevelt proposed the first minimum wage in the United States in 1938, it was proposed as a minimum wage. A group of Southern senators approached President Roosevelt and said, the only way we're going to pass this legislation for a minimum wage is if you create a two-tiered minimum wage system, a minimum wage and a tipped minimum wage. And tipped minimum wage workers will be those categories that are primarily occupied by African Americans. And the minimum wage was something like 48 cents, and the tipped minimum wage was 0. And so the idea, again, was to ensure that African Americans received no guaranteed income and their livelihoods would be a function of tips. that remains with us today. If you know anything about labor policy today, we still have a two-tiered minimum wage system that is rooted in that. Another example of the way in which persistent prejudice manifests is our Social Security system. The original Social Security Act, which was passed by Roosevelt in the 1930s, had as its mission to ensure that no American would grow old in poverty. Again, a group of Southern senators said, we'll go along with this. However, you must exempt certain categories of workers from an entitlement to Social Security. Those categories were the categories of employment occupied mostly by African Americans. And so employers of those categories of workers were not compelled or required to pay into the Social Security system, and those workers had no entitlement to a Social Security benefit. Those kinds of patterns, as they have played through and washed through our systems, our cultures, our practices, persist today. And how we actually, our ability to embrace that reality and respond accordingly are the questions that we're asking at the foundation and we're engaged in.
Right. Well, and it's also the case, I think as many in the room will know, that the Ford Foundation has tried to deal with these questions historically. I mean, and Ford, and particularly in the 60s, during the Bundy years, launched many new programs that focused on just the same population, not with, I think, the same approach that you're using now, but community development corporations, for example, around the country.
Well, a program I benefited from, the Head Start program.
Yes.
I was in the first class of Head Start in 1965. We were sitting on the front of our little shotgun house in Ames, Texas, population 1,400. And my partner always says, who's from Chappaqua, New York, he always looks at the pictures. He's great. And he looks at the pictures. The first time I showed him the picture of our little shotgun house where the Head Start lady came, I said, oh, this is the house. I was a little boy. He said, oh my, what a beautiful rendition of vernacular Southern architecture. And I said, David, it's a shack. It's a shack. And he said, but to my mind, I've never been in the South, but to my mind, it's sort of a vernacular of what you would think of as the American South. And I said, yes, we all lived in shacks. But you know, in 1965, a wonderful young woman approached my mother on the front porch and asked if I could be enrolled in this new program that the Ford Foundation had piloted with a group of child poverty experts at Yale, and that was Head Start. And so we celebrated the 50th anniversary of Head Start last year. But there are lots of programs like that the Ford Foundation, whether it be Head Start or the Pell Grant program, so many programs that was really about ensuring that opportunity, the potential for opportunity to be realized could actually happen. So that kids like me could actually dream and aspire and have those dreams and aspirations be realized.
Right. And then they institutionalize them at the same time in MDRC to do research on it, to LISC, Local Initiative Support Corporation, to build housing and jobs, et cetera. So there's a tradition of that at Ford. How is this sharpening? How's what you're doing now sharpening? You talked about the cultural narratives that are there and sort of trying to deal with them directly and figure out how to counter them. What other ways?
Well, I think we are more sharply, by asking questions about inequality, doing things that may make us all more uncomfortable, because we are sharpening the narrative and to understand the correlation between growing inequality and reduced opportunity, and helping to, I hope, surface a narrative and a frame of our challenge as a society to see that growing inequality ultimately reduces opportunity, and that a loss of opportunity in America means that more Americans are ultimately hopeless, and that hope and hopelessness is actually our greatest enemy. That what hopelessness does in a society that has as its very core the idea of hope and aspiration, that by snuffing that out, you actually undermine the very democracy, the very thing that we love most. And so we hope that we're generating that and contributing to that conversation, and that in very specific ways, whether it be the way we work on racial justice, by bringing a greater focus to the need for criminal justice reform, recognizing what has happened in this country around criminal justice reform. I was just reading today the most, I would say, both enraging and enlightening interview that John Ehrlichman gave after he was released from prison, where he said that the war on drugs wasn't at all about a war on drugs. He explained that the purpose of the war on drugs was to criminalize African Americans, and that by criminalizing African Americans and African American communities, our African American leaders would be less credible and legitimate with the larger population. And he very perfunctorily says it was absolutely a racist intent. It had very little to do. The creation of the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, was in part a response to the Nixon era's effort to actually do this. And so when we have so embedded in our culture the results of that, sadly, that strategy worked. They were very successful in destabilizing and contributing to the dysfunction in many African American neighborhoods. And so while you can be both enraged, you can also be really hopeful. I was responding to someone recently at one of these meetings where someone stood up and said, billions have been spent, there's been no progress, I feel so hopeless, this whole war on poverty, none of it ever worked, et cetera, et cetera. Look at us today. And it's actually not true. From the early 60s to 1976, 77, we made tremendous strides in this country. Poverty was cut in half. By the mid-1970s, the college enrollment rate of African American men was approaching parity with white men. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, literally, our country was making that kind of progress. There were all sorts of indicators of progress. So it is not true when you hear someone say, this has all been for naught, it has been a waste of money. It's simply not true. We absolutely made tremendous progress in this country. And yes, certain things did happen that took us in reverse, but it's not true to say we made no progress.
Right. Talk about, you mentioned this morning about what you're doing in technology and the internet and social media as a way of approaching the cultural narrative kinds of issues.
Well, one of the things that we learned is we asked ourselves today, what are where is opportunity and inequality, where do they converge and collide, if you will? And the internet, of course, is something that 10 years ago, we at the Ford Foundation, I mean, I don't think we barely had computers. I mean, but I think as we talk to experts and people, we really came to understand that in the 21st century, the platform for opportunity in the world is going to be the internet. And yet, very few philanthropies have any programmatic focus on this question. And so for me, it became a very exciting opportunity to think about the future and to think about our mission and how so the internet is amazing. The opportunity is boundless. The risk is that we will replicate in the new digital world the same patterns of discrimination and exclusion that we have in the analog world. And so you can see that by, of course, the issues around free expression are deep and profound, but there are also things that I had no idea about until we really brought in experts. So, for example, we had a talk by a brilliant Harvard professor called LaTanya Sweeney, who she wrote a paper, can computers be racist? I thought, well, can computers be racist? Well, that's an interesting, I want to go to that talk. And so, we turn up and she has this thesis that she tells us, computers, the public thinks algorithms are just this benign thing that are constructed and et cetera, and she says, you're wrong. And she proceeds to click through a PowerPoint that my head was on fire afterwards. She shows how she did simple exercises, like she typed in names that sounded black. So she'd type in Laquita Jefferson. And over time, what would come up for Laquita Jefferson were predatory credit cards, predatory mortgage loans, bail bondsmen, insurance policies that were clearly sort of rip-off kinds of insurance policies. These things that were, and I was just completely shocked. I said, this can't be. So then she types in Mary Margaret Patterson. Okay, a very different thing. Ads for lingerie and ads for a regular mortgage. And just normal things come up. And so she basically shows how companies can create algorithms that search the internet for certain characteristics and can make decisions then based on those characteristics of what kind of products to push. Really amazing. She then goes on to show how parole boards are using increasingly algorithmic equations and reports to help make decisions about who gets parole and who doesn't. And so this is all based on risk analysis. And so, again, she types in black-sounding names, and a particular profile is generated. All things being equal, she types in white name, parolee, and a very different profile is generated. And this is all done through algorithms. I had absolutely no idea. And she demonstrated how the number of, for example, parole boards that are now using these technologies to inform decisions about who gets parole and who doesn't. So and she just went through so many things like that. By the end of like an hour, I sort of ran out of the room and said, we have got to create a new grants program on this. I mean, this is a huge, if you care about what's happening in this country around exclusion and marginalization of people, I mean, these are the same kind of practices that led us to the mortgage crisis with the predatory lending and all the bad things that happened. They're just happening now on the internet.
Right. So what did you do at the foundation to try to create that program?
So we have created we allocated for us a significant initial investment of $25 million a year, hired a first director of internet rights, 3 program officers, and they're, doing amazing work. And part of what we have to do is to do what the Ford Foundation has done. And again, part of the discovery for us was to acknowledge that we sort of what I call the 3 I's is the DNA of the Ford Foundation: investing in ideas and innovation, investing in individual leaders, and investing in institutions and networks. That was the thing that we added. Because today it's not, Ford used to invest in institutions, but today it's investing in networks too. Because lots of people, particularly millennials, are not interested in the kind of architecture of old architecture, old power architecture of organizations, where, I mean, they don't want a big building in downtown Washington or Manhattan with 200 staff and having to raise money. They really are interested in a very different movement building dynamic and a very different power structure. And so we're investing in that now. So what we're learning from our support of Black Lives Matter or Color of Change or Avaz, I mean, these groups that, 5 years ago I'd never heard of, but are doing remarkable things virtually, online, in very lightly structured networks, is transformational potentially.
And you've hired tech fellows, right?
We hired our first, we have our first class of technology fellows. So what I wanted was in each program unit to have a technology expert, a coder, someone who really understood tech policy and could make the bridge between policy and practice.
Right.
And the impact, again, has been really remarkable. One person came up with a way to help legal clinics, an app to help legal clinics more efficiently process eviction proceedings, child support proceedings, these various things that low-income people have challenges with, but just processing them is really inefficient. And so we're innovating and we're experimenting. But I mean, that's the great privilege of philanthropy, is that we aren't bound by an election cycle and worried about getting to the next ribbon cutting so we can be reelected. We aren't driven by some quarterly metric. It allows us to be the R&D for society, and it allows us to invest over the long haul when others wouldn't. Who would have invested? We made the Ford Foundation is deeply associated with democracy in South Africa. That did not happen until 1989. We made our first grant on apartheid in 1952. We were making grants on apartheid and framing the issue. The early years was just frame the issue. Americans had no idea what this apartheid thing even was in 1975. And so to focus on colleges and university campuses and educating students, to focus on corporate leaders and educating them about the ills of their investments in South Africa, and the broader American public to appeal to our values for humanity and fairness and justice. We invested in all of that at a time when it's easy to forget that Oliver Tambo and Nelson Mandela were enemies of the state. They were bad guys, according to the United States government. And yet we were there supporting them in exile, supporting people who supported them. And it's that kind of risk that philanthropy can take.
I'm going to ask one more question, but then open the floor to questions here. You've had to make decisions about, you're supporting institutions as one of your 3 I's, and yet you're getting out of some things that you've done historically. Say a word. I mean, when we had dinner, you talked about the agony of having to tell longstanding Ford grantees that you were not going to support them anymore because there were other things that were more timely at this point that you needed to do. Say a few words about which is which at this point.
Well, I think one of the hard things to do is to make that assessment of when is it appropriate to move on in a program. And of course, many of you who here either are associated with a foundation or have sought foundation funding or have been funded by a foundation and then been told that your program is coming to an end. So probably most people in this room have some understanding of what I'm talking about from a different vantage. So it was very important for us to rigorously look across a very large and complex and varied portfolio of grant-making programs. I think the trustees felt that we had too many programs, and they were right, and that as a result, our impact was really diffused, and that we had so many legacy programs that we wouldn't have the space to do new things like internet rights, for example. And because, yes, it's true, we've been very blessed to have a great CIO, and our endowment went down from the lows of, I don't know, we were at $7.5 billion to back, now at 12. I mean, so we've had excellent management in that regard, but we still don't have the resources to do all the things. So we looked across the portfolio and asked really a set of questions. How far has the dial moved towards the original objectives of the strategy or the initiative? Are we still, as we often are, the early funder of a movement or of a cause or of a set of institutions? How much new philanthropy and new resources are being targeted for this problem that we identified whenever it was? And so that took us to some tough conversations, starting, for example, with the LGBT program. So the Ford Foundation was funding LGBT programming when foundations wouldn't put in their annual reports that their grants were actually for LGBT issues. I mean, people would put human rights or some euphemism. And as we know, when we first started in those early days, something like 30% of the American public supported LGBT rights. I mean, forget about marriage equality. Marriage equality wasn't even surveyed as a question in the early days when we were first making grants. And so as we looked at that issue, we realized many new funders, particularly wealthy gays and lesbians like John Stryker, the Stryker Health billionaire, or David Geffen, or just go down the list of people. Tim Gill, of course. And so there was a lot of new money. But the problems are deeply embedded and very challenging. However, for us, we ask the question, where's the best and highest use of our philanthropic dollar? And by taking our philanthropic dollar out of this space, are we doing harm to the longer term objectives? And we ultimately agreed that we wouldn't be, and that we could work on this issue in a more intersectional way, in a more integrated way, but that we would not have a program on it, and we would not be spending the level that we traditionally spent. And so there was a whole host of programs like that we went through, and in a very pretty systematic way peeled off some things that we simply decided we don't need to do anymore.
Good. Questions? Marty in the back.
Yeah.
Stand up and give your identification. Normally we go around the table, but there's no table today. So you have to do it individually.
I'm Marty Martin. Welcome to North Carolina Home Party.
And the Blue Devils.
If I heard you correctly, you said a few minutes ago that you look to invest in three I's, ideas, individual leaders, and institutions. What I've been looking at recently is the idea around networks and the power of networks to be able to identify and form quickly and to leverage resources, and thinking about how does philanthropy go about doing that. So I think, are you utilizing social network analysis as you look at a field, first to leverage if you're looking to change, and on one hand, and on the other hand, to build the ecosystem of the organizations that are operating in the field, so that you're not placing your bet necessarily on an individual or a particular institution, but you're looking at the power of the network to be able to leverage out?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Marty. And in fact, as we looked at this, we brought in some of the best network theorists working today, both looking at virtual network, because that has become such a powerful dimension of what is the sort of old-fashioned network theory that I studied many years ago. And what we're interested in is, and so yes, we did. And so the question is, how does a grant-making institution intervene without being directive and directing to networks? So networks in their best form are organic. It's not that we foundations say the five of you should be a network. It's that the five of you say you should be a network, and then we as a foundation figure out how to resource you to strengthen and make your network more durable and more effective. And so we are looking across all of the domains where we fund. One of the things I'm actually interested in, though, is networks of philanthropists and philanthropy, and how challenging it is to have effective networks of philanthropists. I mean, it's really interesting to me. I admire so much the Giving Pledge, which I think is a hugely, highly impactful effort. But it's often really difficult to get, because you're talking about individuals who often don't, some of whom aren't comfortable with having their own name, brand, whatever, subsumed in some larger effort. And so what I'm really interested in is how do we more effectively get those of us, including my own institution, which has occasionally suffered from that challenge of saying, well, but if it can't have the Ford name, then maybe it's really not worth our doing. So we need to care less about our brand and more about the brand of the network and the impact of that networking capability.
Well, you did that, of course. You led the effort, you and I think, and Rip Rapson and Alberto, the joint effort that saved the Detroit art collection, the grand bargain that put together a large package of foundations. You all, that's again a kind of an instant network that you put together to do that.
But part of, again, it's really interesting. One of the literature on network theory says that a network of trusted partners has the ability to accelerate impact in a way that a network of strangers doesn't. Because the network of trusted, we have trust, right? So in Detroit, when the judge brought us all together, it's not as if we were strangers. I mean, Kellogg, just name the foundation. We all knew each other. In some ways that was problematic, but we won't go there in this talk. The ways in which it worked was that we all trusted each other. So Rip at Kresge, or Alberto at Knight, or Lejeune at Kellogg, we all knew each other. And so when the judge said, you need to come up with $800 million, we all collectively said to him, you're crazy. So we all could collectively, we knew we could say that, and then we were able to pretty quickly say, here's what we can do, and we do but that was in large part because of the trust that had been established over years of working together.
Right. So, yes, Ted? Yeah, yes.
I'm Doug Zinn, and I'm a Florida, which means I'm mistrusted by both.
Oh, no.
So one thing we are very interested in, we do a lot in K-12. We really ramped up our K-12 funding.
You should say who you are. I know who you are.
Yeah,
But
I'm Doug Zinn with the Keenan Trust.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And welcome.
Thank
to,
you.
To both sides.
Well, thank you. And I'm very familiar with the Keenans, of course.
A lot of philanthropy has been very insular in many ways. So let me just use an example as a classroom. Great things can be happening in the classroom, but if there's no aftercare, if there's poor housing, food deserts, the whole thing. The only way to really change a neighborhood and a community is bringing all the people together. And I think we in philanthropy have that opportunity, not to force it, but everybody's doing their own thing and doing it, and many times really well, but they're doing it in a very sort of insular way. And we're trying to do more of that, of bringing all the folks together and say, let's see if we can change a whole community, and how much are you folks involved in that kind of philanthropy?
Sure. Well, I think the foundation has a long history going back to our work around comprehensive community initiatives, CCIs, which really had, which was the result of learning about the limited impact of kind of parallel interventions that aren't addressed in communities without looking at things holistically. And so I think we learned a lot about that, and we learned from the CCI experience what you say we did wrong, which was for a group of foundations to decide what the community needed. And so there's new work going on. It's, there's always some new name, and now it's called collective impact. And so there is a lot of work going on around collective impact, where different stakeholders and the interventions that need to be knitted together are thought of really holistically, and the people who bring expertise in those different domains, whether it be education or youth employment or housing, really work collectively with communities. I mean, it's something we continue to invest in and are looking at, certainly in our work in Detroit, our work in New Orleans, in New York, in particular, those three places, the kind of collective impact model is the way in which we're working, because I think we've come to the same place you have, which is you can't address these issues in isolation.
Yes, yes.
You want me to stand?
Please. You don't need to stand. You can just tell everybody your name and affiliation.
Okay, I'm Ted Shaw. I'm at the University of North Carolina School of
He
Law.
said he was looking forward to seeing you.
He knows I am. He knows I am.
And I'm the director of the Center for Civil Rights Center. So I'm churning, sitting and listening to this discussion, and can only take a small slice of this, Darren. But I'm sitting here and thinking about, as I say often, the fact that even as we gather here today, 9 out of every 10 days, the presence of people who are now called African Americans in what's now the United States, going back to 1619, have been spent in either slavery or Jim Crow segregation. Right now, 9 out of 10 days. And most people aren't aware of that because the judicial discourse, the political discourse, the social discourse, cuts all of that history and slices and dices it and says that, that's Jurassic, it's not relevant to existing inequality today. And yet, race has been this country's biggest dilemma, and I maintain that it still is. And all we have to do is look at the present political processes and this election season, and it demonstrates that in spite of all the progress we made. So in almost post-Obama, not post-Obama yet, but in what's called the age of Obama, now we have all of this blatant racism. Talk about the internet. It's a dark place. It's a quick race to the bottom. All you have to do is go there and see it, but it's out there. It's up front, and all of the political analysis is about race. And yet, I've been saying for a long time, and others have been saying that race has metastasized into economic inequality, but economic inequality has metastasized well beyond the race piece of it, which is still central. And now we have all these middle-class white folks, demographic changes, and they are the ones who are so angry for reasons that I think I can understand in part. And long thought that if we don't address economic inequality in addition to the race stuff, that the social fabric of the country is going to tear. And I think that's what's happening now, sooner than I thought, perhaps. And so the foundation, either Ford or somebody has to address this stuff. When you add on to it Citizens United, the Citizens United era and world, the social fabric and our democratic processes, we're losing it. So can you talk about that piece of it on top of race, and who's looking at that, and who's addressing it? If it isn't Ford, who is? Am I making sense?
As you always do, Teddy. So I think one of the reasons inequality is what we landed on is because it gets at the core of what you are talking about. And that is the manifestation of inequality is ultimately the unraveling of our democracy. Because what inequality drives is people away from each other and communities away from each other. It breeds distrust and mistrust in our institutions, in other Americans, in the other. And so we have talked about inequality so much, and I speak about it so much in part because this isn't about just race, because it is about race, but it's about more than race. Because the angry white people that we see today are angry in part because they are increasingly hopeless, because the American dream that they have staked everything on is being taken away from them and is increasingly elusive and out of their reach and out of the reach of their children. And that diagnosis is very real, and I think the body politic in this country is, we see the visuals of it every day if you simply turn on the news. Now, that diagnosis may lead to blaming who gets blamed for the dream being taken away. It depends on who you ask and what the forces are. But that is, in fact, why I think people are feeling so disaffected and angry. And so we have to talk about it. And the opportunity for bridging, which is what's needed here, because unfortunately we get into these polemical racial discussions where it's about racism. And again, it is about racism because the vestiges of racial hierarchy are profoundly present in our society today. But we mustn't lose the larger narrative, which is the opportunity to bring people together around recapturing those ideals of opportunity. And what you're seeing is, as more and more communities who we have relied on for social advancement and for harmony. I mean, one of the reasons we made such progress in the 1960s and 70s was because generally the economy worked for more people. And so we know from research that when people feel secure, they are more likely to think about solving the larger problems in society. And when they feel less secure, they are less likely to engage and less willing to engage in questions of the commonwealth. And that's what we're seeing. It's really hard to get people to talk about collective problems because people are increasingly worried about their own security. And this is why we have to get back to these drivers, the drivers of culture, the drivers of an economic system that is too biased to bring outcomes for people like me and many people in this room who don't have to worry about financial security. Well, the system really works for us. I mean, I've been poor, and I know what it feels like when your mother doesn't have the money to pay the telephone bill and your telephone's gonna get cut off and you gotta go run and cash your check and get to the telephone company before 5 o'clock. I know what that, and that is actually the existence of most Americans. But we elites have no understanding of that. And that is why we elites in places like Manhattan, when we look out into America and see these people in stadiums rallying, saying some of the most odious things, we're surprised and we're shocked that there are all these white people in stadiums saying things that we're shocked by. I'm not shocked at all. Many of them have every reason to be angry and outraged. And I just think that unless we're willing to frame it, talk about it, name it, and engage on it, and then say, all right, so as a grant-making organization, what do we do about it? And there's a part of it that is about agenda setting, which is what foundations have historically done, which is to say, we need to move conversations that may be at the margins, we need to move those conversations to the middle. Whether it's about LGBT rights, or whether it's about inequality, or whether it's about what's happening in rural America, where you're seeing the manifestation of hopelessness, in the epidemic of addiction to opiates that we've never had in rural America in this country. I'm talking about rural white America. That is a direct correlation to people feeling that they have no option for livelihood, for opportunity, for education. And so is it a surprise that the neighborhoods, the communities where addiction and these huge challenges are happening are those communities? But that doesn't mean that America gets off the hook for the reasons, for the issues you raised. Because those issues, whether it's in our criminal justice system or in our education system or housing systems, are more profoundly felt than ever.
The gentleman back there.
Hi, my name is William Jackson. I'm over at UNC. I also run a program here in Durham, so whatever.
Welcome, William.
So this is an intriguing question for me around how we actually assess inequality. We're in a country that is so driven by numbers quantitatively, and having worked in kind of void the men of color spaces and racial equity spaces, and I look out on how people say that they're assessing impact for kids of color, or say that they're assessing impact for inequality, and typically those things miss the mark for actually measuring those things. They just have a group of people who are a particular color, they decided to work with them, but they aren't necessarily actually working towards improving equality for those particular groups. So I'm just interested in how Ford is leading the way on that.
Yeah. It's a great question. And that's why we have to, the unsexy, uninteresting, no fun work of talking about structures and systems, we have to talk about. Because, I had the great honor of being on in a discussion with Senator George Mitchell. I was giving a talk up in Maine last week, and he started this remarkable scholarship program that is providing scholarship for low-income students, and many of them students of color. And there was a sense from many people that, well, we need to focus on giving scholarships, and my view on that is yes, 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 and yes. However, if we aren't ensuring that our larger structures, whether they be structures for employment, structures for opportunity and upward mobility, aren't willing to embrace that young student who has received the education credential, and they aren't able to engage in a way that recognizes their full potential, the impact of that scholarship will be limited. And so it's important, we have to focus both, because people often say to me, well, the solution is education. We just need to focus on education. And the answer, I agree with that. We do need to focus on education. But education alone is not going to solve inequality. If we have an unfair tax system that privileges people like me, if we have, and I'm really going to get in trouble
Carried
now,
interest.
if we have, carried interest, oh my goodness, we don't want to talk about carried interest, but, yes, if we have carried interest, if we have a program, and I read a report Vartan sent me the other day from some research that he had his hand on about college admissions.
Right.
It was really interesting. So I didn't know this, but this is what the report says, and it was a credible group of researchers. 30% of legacies who apply to Harvard are admitted. 1 in 3. 1 in 16 low-income applicants is accepted to Harvard. And so when you think about our ideals of equal opportunity, of a level playing field so that everyone has a chance to dream and aspire, there are structures, there are systemic structures that either reinforce privilege and advantage or reinforce disadvantage and exclusion. And it's really hard because these are things that we all hold dear in this country. But if we don't talk about these structures, it's really hard to imagine, because more of these structures are being created as a result. This same report demonstrated that higher income students are able to, at very high numbers, take the Kaplan super duper prep course that costs $5,000 for college prep. It's $5,000 for a college prep a seminar. Well, low-income students have no ability to access that kind of preparatory support as they apply to college. Now, we don't want to penalize someone because they're wealthy. We can't have a system that villainizes aspiration and villainizes people who seek to achieve. We have to lift that up and celebrate that. But we've got to find a balance, and I think we've lost that balance.
Important point. Yes, Mary.
Hi, Mary. Good to see you.
Thank you for being here.
Oh, Mary.
So, to its credit, Ford has been focused on the kind of structural change and systems change that you've just been talking about for a really long time. So, whenever I sit here looking at with Terry Sanford over there, I think back to that partnership between Ford and the Sanford administration, the North Carolina fund. So, my question is, what have you guys learned about what are the strategies that have impact in changing systems and structures, and perhaps what are some new strategies that you're thinking about? I mean, you've touched on like the internet, but what are some other ways you're thinking about really making systems change in the face of some of the obstacles that you very eloquently talked about and others have?
I mean, I think this is one of the great challenges, Mary. I mean, one of the things we learned about effective movement building was that to the degree that in the past we were able to build multiracial coalitions, it increased the likelihood of take-up in the larger community. And that's one of the things, as I say, about the challenge of what's happening in our societies, where it's often harder to get people of different racial groups to come together to solve collective challenges. And so as what we I think believe firmly today, even more so, is that the only way we're going to be successful is to build across sectors, groups, identities, and to build coalitions. That some of the ways in which communities have operated, or particular groups have operated in silos, just doesn't work anymore. It's not possible to work on gender issues without also taking on racial issues. And how we bridge those communities is a critical thing that we are now really examining in new ways, and particularly around the networking and the ability to bring grassroots and grass tops together is another critical. And finally, the role of the private sector and private sector leaders. Of course, we've always engaged with the private sector, but not in a really deep way. And as the private sector and private capital has become more important to how we think about solving many of our large challenges, how do we leverage, how do we organize to aggregate private capital, for example? I mean, we've never thought about that in any meaningful way, and we're thinking a lot about that today.
I want to say what you said earlier this morning about the Koch brothers and criminal justice.
Well, and how we work with people who we might not have worked with in the past. So, and I'll give the example of our criminal justice work because it certainly received a fair amount of attention. When we recently announced a partnership with the Koch brothers and Freedom Works around criminal justice reform. The Freedom Works network again, a really impactful network, has an agenda around criminal justice reform that is very much aligned with the Ford Foundation's agenda. We both agree that we have a national crisis, that far too many Americans are incarcerated, that it's bad for our economy, it's bad for the communities where they have lived, it's bad for their families. And so we have a new Coalition for Public Safety is the name of the organization, and we, MacArthur, John and Laura Arnold down in Houston, and Freedom Works are engaged in an effort to support at the state level, because it is in fact at the state level where it's state penitentiary systems, where most people are incarcerated, are actively engaged. And they have the ability, because they can, through a 501c4, to be engaged in ways in which we can and are not in policy making. And so together, I'm very proud of the fact that we are working together. And I think we have to be more tactical and less ideological and more pragmatic about how we make progress. That is not to say that there are not, at the same time, many efforts underway that I would imagine they don't appreciate that we're doing at the foundation.